Part 1. The house that looked wrong from every angle. For the first 15 seconds of this story, I want you to picture something most folks on the frontier had never seen before. A winter so cold it froze wagon wheels mid-roll. A wind so sharp it could plane a log smoother than any carpenter. And right in the middle of that unforgiving Wyoming basin stood a house that everyone swore would collapse before the year was out. Yet when the great winter arrived, that strange, top-heavy structure didn't just stand tall. It saved lives. If you've ever wondered why some people fail in the storm while others stand unshaken, stay with me. Because this is a lesson worth carrying into your own life, your own home, and your own craft. Dry Willow Basin, Wyoming, 1886. Back then the land was wide open, the sky unforgiving, and most folks believed the only good cabin was a fast cabin. Get 4 walls up, a roof that wouldn't leak too much, and hope the coyotes feared you more than they feared hunger. But one man, a Norwegian carpenter named Jens Halvorsen, didn't build fast. He built right, and because of that, folks laughed at him from the moment he set his stakes into the earth. While every rancher and homesteader around him threw together ordinary box cabins, tight footprints, thin eaves, low profiles meant to hide from the wind, Jens laid out something that looked outright wrong. His ground floor measured 18 by 22 feet, but the second floor? That one stretched wider, 22 by 26, a full 2 feet of overhang on every single side. It looked like a stubborn mule wearing a saddle 2 sizes too big. Folks rode by shaking their heads, saying the whole thing would topple in the first real storm. They laughed at the beams he used, too thick for a poor immigrant and too expensive for open country. They said he was building a tower just to show off. But Jens didn't listen. He kept to his work with a quiet conviction, the kind of confidence you only earn by watching a lifetime of winters destroy the same mistakes over and over again. And for you and me, that's the first lesson of the frontier. The crowd almost always builds for today, but a wise man builds for the 3rd winter, the 7th storm, and the day the world decides to test everything you've made. The truth was simple. Jens wasn't building a strange house. He was building a dry foundation. And that choice, laughed at by neighbors all summer long, would become the difference between comfort and misery, between survival and surrender, when the sky finally turned on the people of Dry Willow Basin. So let's walk with him and see why the man everyone mocked ended up teaching an entire valley how to build not just stronger cabins, but stronger lives. Part 2. Wyoming, land of the unforgiving. Wyoming is a land that teaches you lessons fast and collects payment even faster. The high plains stretch so far that a man can watch weather roll toward him for an hour before it arrives, yet still never be ready for what it brings. The wind here doesn't just pass through, it hunts. It finds weakness in your walls, in your roof lines, in your thinking. It shakes the nails loose from boards and the certainty loose from men. When Jens first stepped into Dry Willow Basin, he didn't swing a hammer. He didn't cut a tree. He didn't even set a stake. He spent 4 long months doing something his neighbors believed was a waste of time. He studied the land. He watched how the autumn winds braided through the grass. He walked in circles after the first early snow to see where drifts formed deepest. He followed the thaw lines to understand where water gathered, how it moved, and which soils stayed damp long after the sun returned. That's lesson number 2, and it's one most modern builders still overlook. Before you build anything, whether it's a cabin, a business, or a life, you study the forces that are going to hit it. Not the easy ones, the hard ones, the ones that only appear in the worst year, not the average one. Jens knew something the others didn't. The Wyoming wind wasn't the real enemy, the melt was. Snow pressed up against a cabin sits like a wet blanket, slowly feeding moisture into the lowest logs. And once a log stays wet long enough, you don't get a second chance. Decay doesn't ask permission. It moves in quietly, then it never leaves. The neighbors didn't see any of this. They were too busy racing the calendar, throwing up quick cabins before the first cold snap sealed the land in frost. They boasted about speed the way men boast about strength. But while they swung hammers, Jens walked the ridgelines at dusk, looking for clues in the snow shadows that only a man raised on hard winters would notice. Wyoming didn't have to prove anything to him. He already knew how the world treats the unprepared. Back in the Telemark Mountains, He had watched entire barns sag and fail, not from storms, but from the slow, quiet creep of moisture eating the beams from the bottom up. And so, when he came to this new land, he carried not just tools, but old wisdom, the kind that doesn't impress anyone until the moment it saves them. And that is where this story begins to turn. Right where everyone else believed Jens was simply slow, he was actually doing the most important work of all. Part 3. The overhang nobody asked for. When Jens finally began cutting timber, the whole basin seemed to pause just to watch the show. A man can cut logs any way he wants, but when he starts shaping them into a house that looks like it breaks the rules of physics, people take notice. And they talk. Oh, they talk. He set the lower story with clean, tight scribing, 18 by 22 feet, solid, respectable. A cabin any homesteader would recognize. But then, he did something that made even the most seasoned frontiersman blink twice. He began setting joists for the second floor that stretched out 2 full feet past the walls below on every side. And on top of that frame, he added eaves that reached 3 feet further still. To the neighbors, it looked like a grown man wearing a child's coat under an oversized cloak. Caleb Moore, the local carpenter who had built half the barns in the valley, shook his head so hard his hat nearly fell off. He declared to anyone within earshot that Jens's house would catch wind like a wagon sheet and fly clear to Montana. Men repeated that line at the saloon for weeks, laughing into their tin cups. But Jens didn't build for their approval. He built for what he knew was coming. Inside those beams, there was intention. The overhang wasn't decoration, it was engineering. The second floor, wider than the first, acted like a shield, pushing falling snow outward instead of letting it bank against the foundation. The long eaves amplified that effect, creating a dry ring around the cabin, even in the worst storms. The roof pitch, 10/12, wasn't just steep, it was strategic. When snow hit it, it didn't stay, it slid. He used 8 by 10 beams driven deep into the frame, 4 feet back, redistributing weight the way a mountain goat spreads its stance across rock. Nothing about the structure was accidental, and yet to the untrained eye, it looked like a disaster waiting its turn. Now here's the part that matters for you and me. In modern times, folks still chase the same shortcut the settlers chased back then. They build flush walls, short eaves, flat roof lines, and then wonder why the moisture finds a way in. They focus on looks, on speed, on convenience, and forget the truth Jens had carved into every beam of that strange house. Water only needs one weakness, one slow patch of melt, one shadowed corner where snow sits longer than it should. And once water finds a home, rot becomes your landlord. Still, the neighbors heckled. They accused Jens of wasting timber he couldn't afford. They warned that the Wyoming wind would twist his house apart like wet bark. And they mocked him for building wide when everyone else built narrow. But the thing about wisdom is this: it rarely looks right at first. It often looks wrong, slow, inconvenient, or excessive. And yet when the storm finally comes, and believe me, it always comes, wisdom reveals itself as the only thing standing. And that turning point, the moment when laughter faded and fear settled in, was closer than any of them realized. Part 4. Early snowfall and first signs. Winter did not knock politely that year. It barged into Dry Willow Basin like an outlaw kicking in the saloon door. By late October, the first snow came sweeping across the plains in long white sheets, weeks earlier than anyone expected. The kind of snow that doesn't fall gently but slants sideways, driven by a wind that seems to have something personal against you. Most cabins in the valley took the storm the way they took every storm. Snow piled against the lower logs. Drifts formed deep pockets around the foundations. And by the third day of cold, you could already see the frost creeping into the corners, inside the ranch houses, working its way beneath floorboards like a thief searching for weakness. But at Jens Halvorsen's strange, wide-shouldered cabin, something different happened. While the wind blasted the basin, the snow that landed on his steep roof slid downward, struck the overhanging second floor, and kicked outward into the yard. Every time the wind changed direction, the same thing happened. The snow kept its distance. A dry ring of earth, 2 to 3 feet wide, circled his entire foundation like a protective moat of air. Neighbors noticed it, of course. They'd ride past on horseback, wrapped in wool and disbelief, staring at the bare ground beneath his cabin, while their own places sat buried like half-forgotten crates. Some chalked it up to luck. Some said the wind was simply blowing in his favor that week. People don't easily accept that a man they laughed at might have known something they missed. Inside their own cabins, the walls already felt colder. The trapped snow pressed against the logs, locking in moisture. And when you trap moisture, you trap trouble. The meltwater from body heat inside the home begins its slow seep into the lower rounds. A log doesn't complain when it absorbs water. It doesn't bend or shout. It simply begins the slow, patient slide toward rot. That's the thing about moisture. It doesn't warn you. It waits. But Jens saw the signs long before they did. He knew that early snowfall was the first whisper of what was coming. The old men from Norway used to say, when winter arrives in a hurry, it plans to stay a long time. And the Wyoming sky was beginning to write a story that none of his neighbors were prepared to read. For the moment, though, the laughter continued. Folks still believed Jens had built his place upside down. They thought they had the upper hand. But winter was nowhere near finished. It had only just begun to sharpen its teeth. Part 5. The Great Blizzard of 86-87 begins. December arrived the way a hammer arrives on a nail, without mercy, without hesitation, and with a single purpose. The storm rolled down from the Montana highlands like a living thing, thick, heavy, and full of hunger. Old-timers later said they felt it before they saw it. Horses grew restless. Dogs refused to leave the porches, and the air turned so still, so hollow, you could almost hear your own heartbeat. Then, in the early hours of December 4th, the sky opened. The first gust slammed into dry Willow Basin like the blow of a giant's fist. Snow didn't fall. It launched sideways, moving faster than a man could run, hissing against windows, filling every crack, every gap, every hollow. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The wind howled through the valley with a pitch that seemed almost human, as if the land itself were screaming. Most families did exactly what their frontier handbooks told them to do. They grabbed shovels, stumbled into the teeth of the storm, and began packing snow tight against the north and west walls of their cabins. It was a tradition handed down by generations. Bank the snow high to trap heat low. In theory, it made sense. Snow has insulating value. Pile it deep enough, and you seal out drafts. But like many frontier tricks, it solved one problem while creating another much bigger one. While neighbors bent their backs into the drifting white, Jens stood in his doorway watching the storm with calm, studying the movement of the snow as if it were a language he understood. He didn't lift a shovel. He didn't pack a single flake against his wall. Instead, he closed the door gently behind him and stoked the fire. To his neighbors, this was the final proof that he was a stubborn, hard-headed fool. By midday, the storm grew violent enough to shake the very frames of the valley's cabins. Snowbanks pressed tight against the walls like a slow-moving avalanche. Doors jammed shut. Windows rattled in their frames. And deep in the logs near the foundations, moisture began seeping into the fibers, an invisible betrayal happening long before anyone realized the danger. Meanwhile, Jens's cabin took the storm head-on. Snow struck the roof, slid down, hit the overhanging second story, and launched outward in a wide arc. A growing berm formed 5 to 6 feet away, never touching the house itself. Wind-driven snow met the jutting upper story and broke around it, leaving a narrow wind shadow hugging the foundation. Inside, the floor remained warm enough that no one had to drag their beds away from the walls. But the storm was just getting started. That evening, as the wind screamed past 50 miles per hour, there was a heavy crack across the basin, a sound like timber breaking under enormous strain. One of the smaller homestead cabins, built hastily with soft cottonwood logs, had shifted on its foundation. The front corner dropped half an inch as the burden of wet, pressed snow buckled the sill beneath it. Neighbors whispered through the blizzard, their fear growing with the storm. The laughter of summer had vanished. The questions began. Why isn't snow piling around Halvorsen's place? Why does his firewood last longer? How does that strange house stay so warm? But the storm wouldn't let anyone go looking for answers yet. Wyoming had only dealt its first blow, and it had plenty more to give. Part 6. Jens's engineering revealed. The storm eased just enough on the third night for Caleb Moore, the same carpenter who once mocked Jens the loudest, to stumble across the basin and pound on his door. His beard was frozen stiff, his gloves crusted with ice, and his voice shook not just from cold, but from something deeper: fear. The kind a man feels when he realizes he's been wrong for too long. Jens pulled him inside, wrapped him in a blanket, and poured hot coffee before saying a single word. When Caleb finally caught his breath, he asked the question that had been gnawing at him all winter. "Why isn't your house drowning in snow like the rest of ours?" Jens didn't gloat. Instead, he took a stick from beside the stove, bent down, and drew a quick shape into the thin frost on the floorboard: a roofline, a second-story overhang, and the ground below. "When snow slides from here," he said gently, tapping the roof, "it hits this ledge and travels away from the home, 5, maybe 6 feet, and when the wind pushes snow sideways, this upper floor breaks the current and creates a pocket of still air, a dry pocket." Caleb stared, stunned. No one had ever talked about using wind as a tool, not an enemy. Jens continued, explaining how the 10/12 roof pitch shed weight before it became a load, how the overhang acted as a shield, redirecting meltwater away from the foundation, how his sill log stayed elevated, aired, and dry, even when the world outside turned to ice. Then came the hardest truth of all, the one Caleb already feared. "Snow against a wall warms on the inside, melts a little, then refreezes," Jens said. "That cycle feeds rot. You'll see it come spring." Caleb lowered his eyes. His own cabin had already begun locking him out, the swollen door frame refusing to sit square. He could feel the damage spreading, even if he couldn't yet see it. What Jens offered next wasn't triumph, it was compassion. "You're a good builder, Caleb," he said. "But you built for last year's winter. This land demands that you build for the worst winter you haven't met yet." For a long moment, the two men sat in silence, listening to the storm claw at the walls outside, a storm Jens's home barely noticed. And as the fire cracked warmly in the stove, Caleb understood what many people never learn. Sometimes the man you laugh at is the man who saw farther than you ever looked. Part 7. Testing Night. The January Kill Storm. January on the Wyoming High Plains has a way of stripping a man down to his bones. But the storm that struck Dry Willow Basin in the second week of 1887 didn't just test bones. It tested judgment. It tested pride. It tested every decision made in the warm months when men believed winter was too far to fear. The warning came as a strange quiet. Birds disappeared, horses refused water, and the air carried a sharp metallic taste, like cold iron pressed to the tongue. Then, in the span of an hour, the temperature plunged from 28 degrees to 4 below, and the wind swept in with a violence that felt biblical. By midnight, the blizzard roared with a sound like rolling freight trains. Snow didn't fall. It slammed sideways, propelled by 60-mile-an-hour gusts that carved ridges into the earth. Whole cabins vanished inside white mounds so deep they might as well have been buried alive. Families huddled together, listening to their walls groan under the pressure, praying each beam would hold just one more minute. Inside Caleb Moore's home, the situation had turned desperate. Snow had choked his doorway so tightly you couldn't have slipped a hand between the door and the drift. The west wall bulged inward, bowed by the wet, compacted mass pressing against it. The sill log beneath the entry had sunk another half-inch, warping the entire frame. Every gust forced icy air through the seams, scattering frost across the floorboards like spilled salt. His children, wrapped in every quilt the family owned, shivered violently even with the stove red hot. Water in the bucket froze solid. A cup left near the floor iced over in minutes. They burned through a day's worth of firewood in 6 hours, terrified to let the stove cool even momentarily. And still, the temperature in the cabin refused to climb above the freezing mark. Caleb tried stuffing clothing into the widening gaps around the door, but the wind clawed at the house harder with every passing hour. He could feel the structure weakening, not suddenly, but the way a tired horse starts giving up under its own weight. A man's pride means nothing when his family is in danger. And pride is exactly what Caleb swallowed when he realized he had only one hope left in the valley. He pulled on his frozen boots, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and forced open a window just enough to squeeze through. The moment he stepped outside, the storm nearly wiped him off the face of the earth. Snow whipped into his eyes until he nearly lost direction. He dropped to his knees, crawling by memory toward the one house still standing proud in the chaos. Jens Halvorsen's strange, mocked, wide-shouldered refuge. Inside Jens's cabin, the experience couldn't have been more different. The floor stayed warm, the windows clear, the logs dry. Snow never reached the walls. The upper-story overhang caught the slides and hurled them outward, forming a protective ring of deep white that had no path back to the foundation. The wind, instead of chewing at the cabin, was split by the overhang into calmer pockets that allowed heat to settle where families needed it most. Jens heard the frantic pounding through the storm. He yanked open his door just in time to catch Caleb as he collapsed inside. Behind him, the storm clawed like a living beast, but the moment the door closed, silence fell like a blessing. Caleb's face was ghost white, his beard frosted stiff, and his voice cracked as he spoke. The cabin won't hold." And those words forced Jens into a decision the frontier never made lightly, leaving shelter in the height of a blizzard. But he didn't hesitate. Frontier men do not turn their backs on neighbors, not when the land turns hostile, not when lives are on the line. He lashed a rope around his waist, tied the other end to a beam inside, and plunged back into the storm with Caleb leaning on him. They fought their way to the cabin, smashed the drift from the door with a fence post, and carried the children out one by one. The cold bit at their faces like 1,000 needles. The wind roared loud enough to drown their shouts. But the rope held, and so did their resolve. By the time Jens dragged the last child through his doorway, half the valley's cabins had already caved under the load or shifted so badly they became unlivable. But his home, the house everyone ridiculed, sheltered 3 families that night. They slept beside the stove, wrapped in blankets, comforted by the crackle of dry wood and the miracle of warmth. The storm didn't end until midday, but if you had stepped into Jens's cabin during its worst hour, you would have thought you were standing in a different world entirely. Outside, winter howled with murderous intent. Inside, wisdom held its ground. Part 8. Spring Thaw, the Hidden Cost. When spring finally arrived, it didn't come gently. It snuck in under the snowpack, melting from below, loosening drifts until they sagged like tired shoulders. The basin transformed into a patchwork of flooded valleys, slick mud, and exposed foundations. And for the first time since the storm, the true cost of winter revealed itself. As the snowbanks receded from the neighbors' cabins, the damage became impossible to ignore. Dark stains bled across the lower logs. The wood felt soft to the touch, spongy in places, as if it had soaked up the entire season. A few cabins sagged visibly at the corners, their sills eaten slowly by moisture that had nowhere to go during the months of suffocating snowbanking. Caleb was the first to truly see the consequences. He pressed his knife blade into one of the lower logs and watched in horror as it sank nearly half an inch with almost no resistance. What looked like solid wood from the outside had been quietly compromised from within. Brown rot had already taken hold. Neighbors gathered, comparing notes with nervous glances. The same story repeated across the basin. Warped door frames, softened corners, mold blooming in crawl spaces, foundation moisture that refused to dry, even under the spring sun. Yet when they visited Jens's cabin, the contrast felt almost unreal. His logs remained golden and firm, dry as the day they were notched. The ground beneath his overhang had stayed mostly exposed through the winter, allowing airflow to wick away melting snow. His foundation stones remained stable and untouched by the freeze-thaw cycle that had cracked so many others. The truth struck the community harder than the storm ever had. They had treated snow as insulation. Jens had treated it as a threat. They had built fast. He had built smart. Moisture had punished their shortcuts, not out of malice, but out of nature's simple rules. Water always wins when a man forgets to respect it. By late May, 2 families were forced to replace entire sills. A few cabins leaned so visibly that they needed jacking and resetting, and everyone whispered the same thing. Halvorsen knew. Why didn't we listen? It wasn't pride anymore. It was regret. Part 9. The quiet shift in a community. A strange thing happens on the frontier when a man's ideas, once mocked, start proving themselves in plain daylight. No one admits he was wrong. Not openly. But the valley began to change in quiet ways. The kind you only notice if you've lived long enough to see how men hide their lessons. One by one, neighbors wandered past Jens's place, pretending to check their cattle or mend a fence, but really studying his cabin. They paced off the distance of the overhang. They squinted at the angle of the roof pitch. Some even traced the shadows cast by the upper story to understand how the wind curled around it. Caleb, now humbled by frost and hard truth, visited often. Not to talk, but to watch. He measured the dimensions with his eyes, memorizing how the beams nested into the frame. He rebuilt his own cabin's eaves that summer, stretching them farther out than any he'd ever built before. Folks joked that he was copying that Norwegian nonsense. Caleb didn't argue. He'd seen what nonsense could survive a winter. Soon other homesteaders followed. New cabins sprouted with wider shoulders, longer eaves, and elevated sills. A few families began raising their foundations on stone piers to escape the spring melt. No one called it the Halvorsen method, but everyone who adopted it knew exactly where the idea came from. Dry willow basins shifted, not with fanfare, but with quiet imitation, the sincerest form of respect one frontiersman ever gives another. By the next winter, half the valley had begun building the way Jens had the courage to build when everyone mocked him. And from that moment forward, the storms never saw the same victory in Dry Willow Basin again. Part 10. Legacy. Frontier Wisdom for Today. 8 years passed in Dry Willow Basin, and time became the most honest judge of all. The winters that followed never matched the savagery of 86 to 87, but they came close enough to remind every homesteader of what they had survived and what they had nearly lost. Cabins built quickly during that first rush of hope and excitement showed their age. Eaves sagged, door frames swelled, foundations shifted, inch by inch, the way a tired man slouches after carrying too much weight for too many years. But Jens Halvorsen's cabin stood there like a monument carved from stubborn wind. The overhanging second story remained sharp and straight. The logs still rang solid beneath a carpenter's knuckle. The foundation stones sat dry even after spring rains that turned other yards to sucking mud. His home looked as if it had stolen time from the land instead of surrendering to it. Young homesteaders arriving in the valley stared at the place with quiet admiration. Most assumed it was newly built. They didn't realize they were looking at a survivor of one of the deadliest winters in frontier memory. They didn't know that every beam had a story, every joint had a lesson, and every inch of extra timber had once been a source of mockery. As the new generation learned the old tales, a slow shift took root. People stopped asking whether Jens's ideas were necessary and started asking why they hadn't been standard all along. Conversations changed at the general store. Instead of arguing about how fast a man could put up a cabin, folks talked about drip lines, airflow, sill elevation, and snow load calculations. The language of the frontier evolved from speed to longevity, from patching problems to preventing them. And these weren't just relics of old-world carpentry. Modern builders, even those with access to synthetic barriers and advanced tools, recognized the wisdom baked into Jens's approach. Roof pitch determines whether snow becomes a friend or an enemy. Overhangs decide whether your walls stay dry or rot from the bottom up. Foundation height dictates whether meltwater passes harmlessly by or settles in like an unwelcome guest. Today, people think these are modern building principles. But the truth is far more humbling. Smart builders like Jens simply paid attention. Attention to water, attention to wind, attention to how the land breathes. They built not for the average season, but for the worst one on record. They didn't wait for disaster to teach its lesson. By 1894, nearly every new structure in Dry Willow Basin carried at least one feature pioneered by the man folks once called foolish. Barns grew wider eaves, homes were raised on stone piers or taller foundations. Even chicken coops and smokehouses had modest overhangs to keep the spring thaw from creeping in, and nobody laughed at the extra lumber anymore. Then came the winter of 1916, a storm nowhere near as famous as 87, yet just as merciless in its own way. New cabins groaned, some shifted. A few buckled under uneven melting and refreezing. But Jens's cabin, the one built by a man who trusted experience over acceptance, it didn't move an inch. And in that moment, Dry Willow Basin understood something deeper than construction. Jens hadn't just built a house. He built foresight. He built patience. He built resilience into timber and stone. And whether folks admitted it or not, they built their futures on the shadow of his long, wide eaves. That old cabin became a quiet teacher for anyone willing to look closely, and its lessons echo even now, long after the last smoke curled from its chimney. Part 11. Closing. Build for the storm you haven't met yet. When you spend enough years living with the land, you start to recognize that storms are never just weather. They're reminders. They test what you've built, but more importantly, they test how you built it. On the frontier, a man learns quickly that shortcuts feel good until winter starts asking for receipts. Jens Halvorsen understood something most people miss. Even today, the forces that shape your world don't care how fast you worked. They care how well you prepared. Wind has no sympathy. Snow gives no warnings, water doesn't negotiate, and time reveals every weakness you choose to ignore. But here's the good news. The same principles that kept Jens's home warm, dry, and standing through the worst winter in decades can guide anyone willing to listen. Build with margin. Build with intention. Build with humility for things you cannot control. Give your foundation room to breathe. Protect what carries your weight, and never assume that because something looks unnecessary today, it won't save your life tomorrow. In many ways, moisture is no different from the challenges you face in everyday life. It rarely arrives as a disaster. It shows up quietly as a drip, a crack, a subtle shift. Most folks ignore it. They call it harmless. They promise to deal with it later. But if you leave it alone long enough, it hollows you out from the inside, just like it does to a log. Wisdom, real wisdom, doesn't come from surviving storms. It comes from understanding that storms will come again, and the next one might be worse than the last. So whether you're building a house, a homestead, a family, or a future, remember the lesson of Dry Willow Basin. Don't build for applause, don't build for speed. Build for the third storm, the seventh winter, the challenge you can't yet see. Out here on the frontier, we have a saying: a strong roof keeps you warm, but a strong foundation keeps you alive. And that's the truth Jens left behind, a truth worth passing on. If you enjoyed this story and the lessons tucked inside it, lessons carved from real winters, real timber, and real lives, make sure to subscribe to Frontier Ways. We tell the stories that help you build better, think deeper, and stand stronger when the wind comes calling. And trust me, the wind always comes calling.